June 6, 1944. Dawn broke over Omaha Beach with a color no camera ever truly captured. A sickly gray, smeared by smoke, salt spray, and burning vehicles. The entire coastline shuddered under artillery. Thousands of men lay pinned behind the shingle bank, breathless, drenched, and unable to move forward. The plan had collapsed within minutes. Engineers were supposed to clear the exits. Infantry was supposed to push inland. Armor was supposed to break the German line. None of that happened. The tide had turned the beach into a killing ground, and Exit 1, the only viable route for half the sector, remained blocked by seawalls, wreckage, and sandbanks too deep for any vehicle to cross. Through this chaos, an armored bulldozer, the last one still operational, sat half buried in sand, peppered with bullet dents, its crew either dead or wounded. It looked like a casualty itself, another piece of metal that would rust beside the tide. But for the men trapped behind it, that machine represented the only chance of carving a way off the beach. And beside it crouched a man who did not look like anyone's idea of a battlefield savior. Private Vinton W, 37 years old, quiet, methodical, a construction worker before the war. He was not a decorated hero, not a dramatic figure, just a bulldozer operator. Superiors warned him the mission was suicide. 5 operators had taken the seat already, all killed in minutes. Yet Dove moved with an expression that startled the men watching him. No panic, no hesitation, just focus, as if he were back home leveling earth on a work site, not standing inside the deadliest place on Omaha Beach. German gunners quickly registered his position. They knew that if the bulldozer moved, the Americans would have a path inland. So they poured fire onto that one machine, as if destroying it could stop the entire invasion. Sand jumped in constant fountains around the tracks. Bullets rang off the steel like hammers striking iron. Dove waited, breathing slowly, studying the angle of the blade, listening to the engine cough beneath the armor. Then he climbed onto the seat and pulled the levers. He had one task: cut a road through hell. The bulldozer's engine roared to life with a coughing growl, loud enough to draw every German gunner within earshot. Men lying behind the shingle bank instinctively ducked as the sound carried across the beach. A sound that meant someone was moving, someone was trying something. For a moment, no one believed the dozer would last 10 seconds. Operators before Dove had been cut down before they even adjusted the blade. But Dove acted differently. Instead of lunging into motion, he paused. He listened. He adjusted the throttle with tiny, almost delicate movements. He nudged the blade down a few inches, then raised it again, feeling for resistance, like a craftsman testing the grain of a board before cutting it. The soldiers watching him later said he looked less like a man under fire and more like a mechanic diagnosing a familiar machine. Then Dove pushed forward, slowly at first, deliberately slow, letting the dozer bite into the sand at the correct angle. German machine gun bullets hammered the armor plating, sending sparks skittering across the blade. Rifle shots pinged off the canopy. Mortar fragments clattered against the tracks. To everyone else, it sounded like the machine was being torn apart. But Dove barely reacted. His eyes stayed fixed on the ground ahead of him. He trimmed the sand, backed up, corrected, pushed forward again. Each pass carved out a little more of the slope. Each correction widened the fragile path. With every yard gained, more men could crawl closer, using the growing trench as cover. Dove didn't look up to see any of them. He didn't wave. He didn't shout. He simply worked, the same rhythm he'd used back home, flattening driveways or clearing lots. He held the levers with the calm grip of a man who trusted his hands more than he trusted luck. From offshore, 5 miles out on USS Augusta, General Omar Bradley lifted his binoculars. Among the chaos, he saw a single armored, inching forward through the funnel of German fire. Not a tank, not an assault gun, a bulldozer. Bradley knew the significance instantly. If that machine survived, the Americans could escape the killing ground at Omaha. If it didn't, thousands might remain pinned until the tide erased them. Down on the beach, Dove made another pass, sand spilling away from the blade like water. Sparks danced across the armor. The firing intensified, and still he worked, steady, measured, unhurried. It looked impossible, but the road was beginning to take shape. By mid-morning, the beach behind Dove had transformed into a scene that defied any sense of order. Medics dragged wounded men into shallow depressions. Infantry officers tried to reorganize shattered units. Engineers crawled forward with demolition charges, only to be pinned again by machine gun bursts from the bluffs. Yet through it all, Dove's bulldozer kept moving in slow, purposeful arcs, cutting deeper into the sand, widening the path inch by inch. Every time the blade came up, steam and dust drifted from its edges like breath from a massive animal. The Germans recognized the danger now. Their fire changed tone, from scattered bursts to concentrated, sustained streams. A machine gun on the right flank stitched the bulldozer's side with a chain of impacts that dented the armor into rippling crescents. Mortar teams bracketed his position, sending geysers of wet sand into the air. Dove never sped up. If anything, he became even more precise, letting the engine settle between bursts, easing the blade into the earth as though the world around him were silent. American soldiers nearby shouted at him to get down, to wait for smoke, to move only when the shelling lightened. Dove ignored all of it, not out of arrogance, but because the machine demanded more focus than the battle did. Later, he would explain that when he worked a bulldozer, everything else collapsed into background noise. Even bullets, even war. Bit by bit, the path took form. A sloping corridor carved into the shingle, wide enough for infantry to crouch and advance, and soon to be wide enough for vehicles. Men began using it as soon as it was deep enough to crawl through. Every few minutes, a new wave of soldiers scrambled up the lane, hugging its sandy walls, racing out of the exposed kill zone. Some slapped the dozer's armor in wordless gratitude as they passed. Dove did not respond. He didn't even turn his head. The machine needed alignment. The sand needed cutting. This was just work. Across the surf, observers on Augusta watched the progress with disbelief. Reports filter back to Bradley. The bulldozer is still moving. The operator is still alive. The men are getting through. The general lowered his binoculars, stunned by what seemed like the calmest defiance he had ever witnessed. On the beach, Dove backed up again, adjusted the blade another inch, and drove forward into the gunfire, reshaping Omaha Beach with the quiet stubbornness of a man determined to finish the job he started. The deeper Dove cut into the shingle bank, the more impossible his calm appeared to the men around him. Engineers from the 37th crawled alongside the dozer between passes, checking slopes, removing stray obstacles, and marking small adjustments with gloved hands. They shouted measurements through the thunder of gunfire, but Dove never looked at them. He simply registered their signals, nudged a lever, and made the correction. The bulldozer vibrated under constant impact, each bullet strike rattling through the armored seat like hail on a tin roof. But Dove's posture stayed unchanged. Shoulders slightly hunched, hands steady, eyes narrowed on the shifting ground ahead. At one point, a mortar shell detonated close enough to throw a curtain of sand over the dozer, burying half the engine hood. Soldiers nearby instinctively ducked, expecting the machine to stall or the operator to abandon it. Instead, Dove brushed sand off the controls with one hand, revved the engine twice, and kept cutting. The engine coughed, belched black smoke, then settled back into its steady rhythm. The absurd normalcy of his movements under fire astonished even hardened veterans. One infantryman later said Dove looked like a man irritated by weather, not war. The Germans, increasingly desperate, shifted heavier weapons toward the exit. An 88mm gun on the ridge rotated to engage the dozer, its crew working frantically to find an angle. When the shell finally came, it slammed into the bank just above the blade, blowing out a section of sand and showering Dove and debris. The blast rocked the bulldozer violently, lifting one track momentarily off the ground. Engineers yelled for Dove to stop, to take cover, to wait for smoke support. He backed up 3 feet, dropped the blade, and resumed carving the slope. That stubborn persistence began to change the beach itself. For the first time since dawn, a navigable passage existed. Soldiers streamed through in widening numbers, signalmen, medics, assault troops, officers clutching radios. The bottleneck loosened, pressure shifted, and commanders finally had the foothold they needed. Dove's road wasn't just a path. It was momentum. It was the first break in the paralysis that had held Omaha Beach hostage for hours. From a shoreline to the ridge, German gunners saw it too. And now they focused on one goal: stop the bulldozer, and the advance would choke again. But Dove, still working as if leveling a driveway back home, was nowhere near finished. As the path widened, the beach began to breathe. Units that had been stranded since dawn finally threaded through the carved lane and regrouped on the far side of the shingle. Officers shouted new orders. Riflemen sprinted forward, crouched low, and began firing back at the bluffs with fresh determination. The entire left flank of Omaha Beach seemed to pivot around the work of one man and one machine. And still Dove pushed, reversed, corrected, and pushed again. The rhythmic back and forth of a laborer shaping earth according to invisible lines only he understood. The German response grew frantic. Machine gun teams shifted positions to find a cleaner angle. A sniper's bullet struck the armored canopy inches from Dove's temple, gouging a bright scar along the steel. Mortar rounds swooped overhead in thick arcs, some landing so close that the shock waves rippled through the dozer's frame. Twice, the engine nearly stalled from concussion. But Dove compensated automatically, easing the throttle, letting the machine settle, then continuing as if nothing had interrupted him at all. Soldiers nearby began referring to him as the man who wouldn't duck. Others called the Bulldozer our only tank. One exhausted rifleman later recalled watching Dove work and thinking, if that guy's not scared, maybe I don't have to be either. Dove had no idea he was inspiring anyone. He didn't even notice the growing crowd of infantry moving through the lane he'd opened. He only noticed when the soil became too loose, or when the blade angled wrong, or when the slope required shaving instead of cutting. To him, the battle was measured in inches, not explosions. A major from the 1st Infantry Division crawled up beside the machine during a lull in the shelling. He slapped the armor twice to get Dove's attention and shouted up at him, asking how long until the road was ready for vehicles. Dove glanced down briefly, the first acknowledgement anyone saw him give all morning, and answered in a flat, matter-of-fact tone when the ground says it's ready. Then he went right back to work. Behind him, engineers finished clearing mines around the approach. Infantry squads lined up to push through the new opening. You could feel a shift in the air. The moment when a hopeless situation becomes merely difficult, and from difficult becomes possible. All of it hinged on Dove finishing the job, and the Germans were preparing one more attempt to stop him. The Germans' final attempt began with an eerie pause, a momentary silence that swept across the beach like a hell breath. Veterans later recalled that everything suddenly went quiet except for the bulldozer's engine, chugging steadily as Dove made another careful pass. He didn't notice the shift. Others did. Experienced infantrymen shouted warnings. Medics crouched lower. Officers scanned the ridge, sensing something about to break loose. Then it came. A coordinated barrage. Heavier, sharper, closer than anything that had hit before. Mortars landed in clusters, pounding the area around exit E1 like drumbeats. Machine guns opened simultaneously from multiple nests, firing long. Disciplined bursts meant not to suppress, but to annihilate. And above them all, the low thunder of an 88mm cannon rolled again, its crew now fully zeroed in on the bulldozer's position. The first 88mm shell slammed into the bank just behind Dove, throwing a fountain of sand over the canopy and knocking the dozer forward on its tracks. The second exploded close enough to peel away some of the armor bolted around the engine. Shrapnel tore into the sand around Dove's feet, ringing off steel with a sound more violent than gunfire. Still he worked. Still he didn't duck. With each pass he made now, the dozer created more than a road. It carved a line the Germans couldn't afford to let stand. The path had become wide enough for jeeps, wide enough for anti-tank guns and nearly wide enough for Sherman tanks. If vehicles reached the bluffs, the German defense on this sector would collapse. They understood this. Their escalating fire reflected it. American soldiers watched in disbelief as Dove steadied the blade again, making micro-adjustments while the world detonated around him. He was covered in dust and smoke, face streaked with grime, eyes focused on nothing but the sand directly in front of the blade. A young corporal who crawled past him later said, "He looked like a man trying to finish a job before lunch." Another 88 millimeters round tore into the slope, showering the Bulldozer in fragments. This time the machine lurched so violently it stalled, the engine coughing out with a sudden metallic gasp. Men screamed for Dove to abandon it. No equipment was worth dying for. But Dove didn't even turn his head. He reached for the ignition, primed the throttle, and tried again. The first attempt failed. The second sputtered. The third roared the engine back to life, louder and angrier than before. The Germans threw everything they had at him. He answered by lowering the blade and pushing forward. The renewed roar of the engine cut through the chaos like a declaration. Soldiers who had been bracing for the machine to die felt a surge of disbelief. The Bulldozer lived, and Dove was already angling the blade for another cut. His face remained expressionless, but his movements quickened. Not frantic, not panicked, just efficient, as though the barrage had only reminded him that the tide was rising and time was running out. Every motion he made mattered now. The slope was nearly complete, but the final stretch, where sand met the harder-packed soil beneath the shingle, required precision. Too steep and vehicles would bog. Too shallow and the path would collapse under weight. With shells bursting around him, Dove leaned slightly to one side, watching the blade meet the earth as though he were shaving millimeters from a wooden plank. Nearby infantry took advantage of the chaos. As the Germans concentrated everything on the Bulldozer, American riflemen and bar gunners surged up the newly carved lane, fanning out along the far side of the shingle. For the first time, concentrated small arms fire pushed upward toward the bluffs from close range. German positions that had dominated the beach since dawn began taking hits from angles they had not anticipated. Some crews shifted fire. Others were forced to take cover. But the heaviest guns kept firing at Dove. They understood the stakes. Another mortar round landed, so close that the concussion nearly threw Dove from the seat. He grabbed a lever to stabilize himself, blinked hard, and resumed lowering the blade. A deep, narrow swath peeled away, sand cascading down in neat waves. The path widened another 2 feet. On the left flank, an engineer captain shouted that the grade was nearly perfect. Dove didn't answer. He reversed, adjusted, and made another pass. Behind him, a medic carrying a wounded man paused long enough to stare. Later he said, "It didn't look like bravery. It looked like a man refusing to stop." From the ridge, German machine guns spat out their longest bursts yet desperate continuous streams of fire. The impacts hammered the armor in a deafening rattle. A corner panel finally gave way, shearing off and tumbling into the sand. Dove glanced at the missing piece for half a second, then shifted the blade again. The machine was coming apart, but the road was almost done. Then, for the first time, the German fire began to waver. Not stop, not even slow, but waver. Because the Americans were no longer trapped. They were moving, advancing, firing back from positions Dove had made possible. The beach was turning, and Dove was about to finish the cut that made it happen. By late morning, the transformation of Exit 1 was undeniable. What had begun as an 8-foot barrier of shingle and sand, an impenetrable wall that had trapped thousands, was now a rough but navigable corridor. The first engineers to stand at the far end of the slope looked back toward the water and saw something no one had imagined possible just hours earlier. A steady flow of moving men instead of a beach full of bodies pinned in place. Dove's road was not elegant. It was not uniform, but it was holding, and that was enough to change the entire rhythm of Omaha Beach. Vehicle crews who had been waiting offshore were finally given the signal to prepare. Staff officers, leaning over maps smeared with seawater and blood, began rewriting the sector's timeline around a single line of cleared sand. Tank commanders stared at the narrow opening with disbelief, some unable to fathom that one bulldozer, had accomplished what naval gunfire and coordinated infantry assaults had failed to do. On the beach, Dove was finishing the final shaping of the slope. Every inch mattered. The first vehicle would determine the fate of the path. If it bogged, the lane would become another choke point. If it crested the shingle and reached firm ground, the exit would be declared operational. Dove worked with this knowledge, though he showed no sign of pressure. He adjusted the blade one last time, carving a clean channel down the center, leveling the loose sand, smoothing the transition to the higher ground. The firing from the bluffs remained fierce, but something had changed. The German gunners were losing initiative. They had spent precious time and ammunition trying to kill one man and one machine, and now American fire teams were pressing them from new angles. Smoke drifted across the ridge where grenades and rifle grenades had found their mark. Machine gun nests that had dominated the shoreline were now struggling to find stable fields of fire. A lieutenant from the 2nd Battalion approached the Bulldozer, crouched low, and signaled Dove. The slope was ready. Vehicles were lining up. The final pass was complete. Dove eased the machine backward, letting the engine idle as he finally paused to look at what he had carved. It wasn't pride that crossed his face, more a quiet, workmanlike confirmation. The job, as far as he could judge, was finished. Behind him, engineers cleared debris from the base of the path. Infantry formed a loose cordon to protect the opening. A Jeep engine revved nearby, its driver staring up the lane with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The moment had arrived. The first vehicle was about to attempt Dove's road. The Jeep hesitated at the foot of the path, its engine sputtering as the driver weighed the risk. One bad rut, one patch of soft sand, and the vehicle could flip or bog down, blocking the exit again. A crowd of infantry, engineers, and medics watched in tense silence. For hours they had hoped for this moment. The moment a machine could finally break free of Omaha's killing ground. Now everything depended on the road Dove had carved under fire. The driver shifted into gear, exhaled sharply, and accelerated. The Jeep climbed the first incline, tires kicking loose sand into the air. It jolted over the uneven base, drifted slightly to one side, then straightened. Soldiers held their breath. The machine climbed steadily, engine whining, suspension bouncing. Halfway up, the wheels slipped for a heartbeat, digging into soft earth, but the slope held. Dove's grating, invisible to most eyes, made the difference. The blades had cut deep enough to anchor the tires, but not so deep as to bog them. The Jeep lurched forward again and crested the shingle. It cleared the top. The path held. A roar erupted from the men below, not a cheer of triumph, but of profound, exhausted relief. Engineers slapped one another on the shoulders. Infantry who had been pinned for hours finally allowed themselves to believe that Omaha Beach was changing. For the first time since dawn, movement felt possible. Escape felt possible. Survival felt possible. From offshore, General Bradley watched the tiny of the Jeep rise and vanish behind the ridge. He lowered his binoculars slowly. Around him, staff officers confirmed. Exit 1 was open. The sector could begin pushing inland. Bradley asked who had cut the road, expecting the answer to involve a coordinated engineering unit or specialized equipment. Instead, he was told. One bulldozer operator did it alone. Dove didn't look up when the Jeep crested. He merely eased the blade up, nudged the throttle, and repositioned the dozer for a smoothing pass. There was more work to do. The lane had to be wide enough for heavier vehicles, stable enough for repeated use, and clear of remaining debris. He operated with the same calm he had shown all morning, as though he were nowhere near the center of one of the most chaotic battles in military history. More vehicles lined up behind the Jeep. Light trucks, command cars, anti-tank guns, and somewhere behind them, the first Sherman tank began to inch forward. Dove's path would soon face its greatest test. The Sherman tank rumbled toward the mouth of the newly carved lane, its treads grinding over smashed equipment and broken steel as it approached the slope. Every man on the beach seemed to turn and watch. A jeep could slip through cracks. A truck might wobble and still survive. But a 30-ton tank was the true measure. If Dove's path held under that weight, the exit was secure. If it collapsed, the sector would choke again and the Germans might regain control. The tank's commander popped his head from the hatch, scanning the incline with a skeptical frown. He had seen bulldozers try and fail on training grounds under perfect conditions. This slope had been carved under machine gun fire, mortar blasts, collapsing sand, and shrapnel storms. Even he didn't understand how it existed. He signaled his driver. The tank lurched forward. The treads hit the incline and immediately kicked loose a wave of sand. The slope vibrated under the weight, and men along the path braced for failure. Dove watched impassively from the bulldozer's seat, resting one hand on the blade lever. He wasn't worried about the tank. He was watching the soil, watching how it shifted, watching where he might need to reinforce it. The Sherman crawled upward, engine growling. Halfway up, the right tread dipped sharply. Gasps erupted. The tank leaned, groaned, and the commander shouted for the driver to adjust throttle. The slope held. The tank straightened. The cut Dove had made, painstaking inches carved under fire, had created enough stability to distribute the tank's weight across the firmer ground beneath the shingle. The tank clawed its way higher, throwing dust into the air, inching toward the crest. Finally, with a grinding roar, it climbed over the last lip and rolled onto solid terrain beyond the beach. Soldiers along the path erupted into shouts, not cheers of adrenaline, but deep, stunned disbelief. Some pounded their helmets. Others slammed hands against the bulldozer's armor. A few simply slumped where they stood, overwhelmed by the realization that they had survived long enough to see armor break through. In that moment, Omaha Beach changed. The bottleneck shattered. Movement became momentum. Momentum became advantage. American forces could now push inland, reinforce the battered infantry, and begin the long fight toward the bluffs and beyond. Dove watched the tank disappear behind the ridge and finally exhaled. Not because the danger had passed. German shells were still falling, but because the ground had behaved exactly as he expected. The cut he made was sound, and he knew what came next. He angled the blade again. There were more vehicles coming. The road needed widening. With the first Sherman safely on firm ground, the flow of vehicles increased. Trucks loaded with ammunition, jeeps carrying reinforcements, and medical evacuation vehicles began using Dove's lane. Engineers followed close behind, clearing debris and widening the cut, but every vehicle that rolled past owed its passage to the precision work of one man under unrelenting fire. Soldiers who had been pinned for hours sprinted along the newly accessible path, many looking over their shoulders in disbelief at the destruction they were leaving behind. Dove continued operating the bulldozer as if he were still on a quiet construction site. Each pass smoothed the lane, stabilized the slope, and widened the path so heavier vehicles could pass. His hands were raw, his uniform shredded by flying sand and shrapnel. Yet he maintained the same unflappable rhythm that had carried him through hours of bullets and explosions. No one around him truly understood how he remained so composed, moving with the detachment of a man solving a technical problem rather than surviving a battlefield. German fire, now sporadic but still deadly, continued to target him. Mortars thudded into the bank, bullets ricocheted off armor, and nearby explosions sent plumes of sand flying like miniature volcanoes. Other soldiers sought cover or returned fire, but Dove remained on the dozer, lowering the blade, correcting the slope, and driving forward with calm precision. Each adjustment he made had life or death consequences for the hundreds of men now using the lane. From a USS Augusta, Bradley watched the lane fill with movement and realized the significance. This was no longer just a bulldozer in a firefight. It was a decisive element in the battle. Dove's calm efficiency had shifted the momentum of Omaha Beach, allowing American forces to consolidate, move inland, and relieve isolated units. Analysts would later study the operation, but in that moment, It was a simple truth. One man's focus under pressure had saved hundreds of lives. By midday, the exit at E1 was fully functional. Infantry advanced off the beach without hesitation. Vehicles, supplies, and medical teams streamed past Dove's path, each trip testament to the lane he had forged. The tide of battle, once pinned by an unyielding shingle bank and relentless German fire, had finally begun to turn. Dove eased the Bulldozer back for another pass, smoothing rough edges, ensuring that the road would hold for the hours to come. Even in the midst of victory, he continued to work, because for him, the task was never about glory. It was about completing the job. By late afternoon, Omaha Beach was transformed. What had begun as a chaotic, deadly expanse of pinned soldiers and wrecked vehicles was now a corridor of movement and hope, all because one man had approached combat with the precision of a craftsman. Private Vinton W, a bulldozer operator with no fanfare, no medals yet, and no intention of stopping until the work was done, had become the pivot point for an entire sector of the invasion. Soldiers walked past him, some offering thanks, some merely nodding, too stunned to speak. Engineers inspected the lane, noting the grade, the slope, the stability of the sand under the weight of vehicles. All of it had been achieved under conditions no training manual could replicate. Under concentrated German fire, amid exploding mortars, machine gun bursts, and artillery that had already killed 5 of his comrades. Dove's methodical focus had not just carved a path through sand. It had carved a lifeline for thousands of men. From offshore, commanders and observers understood the significance. Bradley later remarked that he had never seen anyone work with that level of calm in the middle of a firefight. Military analysts recognized that Dove's detachment and focus, treating combat like routine, technical work, allowed him to perform under extreme stress in a way that few others could. It became a case study, appearing in Army engineer training manuals for decades, illustrating how focus, preparation, and methodical execution could save lives in combat. In the years following, Dove's work would be remembered not for heroics in the traditional sense, but for mastery of his skill applied in the most extreme circumstances. Omaha Beach could have remained a slaughter zone for hours longer. Tanks could have been bogged, soldiers trapped, supplies delayed, and the invasion pushed back. Instead, because Dove treated combat like Saturday afternoon back home, the momentum shifted, countless lives were saved, and the beach finally became a viable point of American advance. Hill 400 had its legends, and so did Omaha Beach. Yet unlike a famed infantry assault or tank breakthrough, this story was quiet, almost invisible. The calm hand that held firm while bullets flew, the man who trusted the machine, the sand, and his own skill above all else. Private Vinton W, Dove became a symbol of disciplined focus, a reminder that sometimes survival and victory is forged not in glory, but in the relentless, precise execution of a single essential task. The Battle of Omaha Beach would be remembered for years, but those who walked inland never forgot the lane carved by a bulldozer, guided by the hands of one man, under the heaviest fire imaginable.